It wasn't the first time I questioned why we were out here, pushing the edges of the galaxy, mapping uncharted systems like cartographers of an endless sea. Space exploration wasn't what it used to be. When humanity first touched the stars, we dreamed of encounters, other beings, other minds. Decades later, the vast, indifferent universe had taught us that we were more likely to find barren rocks than intelligent life. And yet, every so often, the cosmos had a way of surprising us. I was mulling over this contradiction when Lieutenant Carter Vale interrupted my thoughts from the pilot's chair. "Captain, you're going to want to see this," Carter said, his tone pulling me out of my reverie. He rarely sounded impressed, which was why I hurried over to the viewport. At first I thought it was Earth. The blue oceans, the green landmasses, even the scattered cloud formations, it was uncanny. The image fed from our long-range scanners seemed to mock us. It was impossible. We weren't anywhere near the Sol system. "Is that?" Dr. Patrick Dalton, our biologist, trailed off, peering over my shoulder. "No," I said flatly. "It's not, but damned if it doesn't look like it." I ordered the Stellar Seeker into a holding orbit while we ran detailed scans. It didn't take long for the results to come in. The planet's atmosphere was breathable, with nitrogen-oxygen levels nearly identical to Earth's. Oceans mirrored the salinity of ours. Even the weather patterns seemed familiar. But there were discrepancies. The magnetic field was erratic, fluctuating in ways that would wreak havoc on navigation systems. Surface scans picked up strange materials in the soil. Nothing toxic, but compositions we couldn't classify. Then there was the most glaring anomaly of all. The land masses matched Earth's almost perfectly, but there were no signs of human civilization. No cities, no satellites, no radio signals. Parallel evolution, Patrick speculated as we gathered in the ship's common room. His face was lit with excitement. "We've theorized about this for years. A planet so similar to Earth that it follows the same geological and biological trajectories. Except it's not the same," Carter cut in. "Something's off. Too many coincidences." "And that's why we're here," I said, leaning over the holo display. "To investigate. This is the kind of find that could rewrite everything we think we know." That was enough to convince the crew, though Carter's skepticism hung in the air. Landing was harder than expected. The planet's unpredictable magnetic field threw off our descent, forcing Carter to wrestle with the controls. By the time we touched down on a grassy plain near a coastline, sweat was running down his brow. "Mag field's worse than we thought," he muttered. "We'll need constant recalibration just to keep the Seeker functional." The view outside was hauntingly beautiful. Rolling green hills stretched toward a distant range of mountains, capped in snow. The ocean glittered under a sun that looked just a little too big in the sky. Everything was familiar but sharper, as though someone had turned up the saturation on Earth. The soil beneath our boots was firm but strangely warm, and the grass had an almost metallic sheen in the sunlight. "This place is alive," Patrick said, crouching to examine a cluster of flowers that shimmered like molten gold. He scanned one with his handheld device. Photosynthetic structures, similar to Earth plants but more efficient. They're absorbing sunlight at wavelengths beyond what we can see. Carter stayed close to the ship, his hand resting on his sidearm. He didn't say anything, but his body language screamed unease. We split into teams, collecting soil samples, cataloguing the flora, and scanning the horizon for any signs of life. The first sign that something wasn't right came when we tried to orient ourselves. Carter's navigation tools kept resetting, pointing us back towards the ship no matter where we moved. Meanwhile, Patrick noticed something strange in a cluster of low, vine-like plants tangled around the base of a nearby tree. "Cap, you seeing this?" Carter called out, pointing toward the horizon. I followed his line of sight and saw a herd of creatures grazing in the distance. At first glance, they looked like deer, but as they moved, their bodies twisted in ways that broke the rules of anatomy. Limbs bent at bizarre angles, and their movements were fluid but disjointed, as though they weren't quite in sync with the ground beneath them. By the time we regrouped at the ship, the sun was beginning to set. The sky turned a deep orange, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally across the plain. "Captain, I think we should reconsider staying overnight," Carter said. "This place, there's something wrong here." "We've barely scratched the surface," I countered. "We're explorers. This is what we signed up for." Carter didn't argue, but his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. As night fell, the landscape transformed. The grass seemed to glow faintly under the stars, and the metallic sheen of the plants became more pronounced. Rivers sparkled like liquid silver, and the air felt almost electric. Patrick spent hours cataloguing specimens, his enthusiasm undimmed, but even he couldn't ignore the subtle wrongness that hung over everything. "I can't put my finger on it," he admitted as we sat around a campfire, the ship looming behind us. "This planet, everything is too precise, like it's been designed. But by who? Or what?" It was a question I couldn't answer. The phenomenon began just after midnight. Carter was on watch, pacing near the ship, while the rest of us tried to get some sleep. I woke to the sound of his voice, tense and urgent. "Captain, you need to see this!" At first I didn't understand what he was looking at. Then I saw vague figures, indistinct and wavering, moving in the distance. Their shapes barely defined against the dim light. They seemed to flicker, like heat mirages, shifting subtly but definitely closer. "What the hell is that?" Patrick whispered as he joined us, his breath catching. The figures stopped, forming a loose line across the plain. They stood motionless, as if watching us. Then, one by one, they melted into the landscape, disappearing into the rolling hills without a sound. "Captain, I'm telling you, we need to leave," Carter said, his voice tight with controlled panic. As the sun rose, the planet's beauty returned, chasing away some of the tension from the night. But the unease remained, lingering at the edges of my thoughts. The figures, the anomalies, the eerie familiarity of the landscape, it all pointed to something bigger, something we didn't yet understand. Standing on the grassy plain, I looked out toward the mountains, the wind brushing against my face. "We came here to explore," I said, "and that's exactly what we're going to do." Patrick was buried in his samples, eager to make sense of what he called the most important find of our lifetimes. I envied his focus. My thoughts were still on the figures we'd seen the night before. Were they real? Or had our imaginations gotten the better of us in this strange environment? "Captain, we've got work to do," Carter said, snapping me back to reality. His tone was clipped, his distrust of the planet and my decision to stay, clear in every syllable. "Let's move," I said, not entirely convinced myself. The mission wasn't over. We headed inland, following the coastline for a few kilometers before veering into the rolling hills. Patrick stopped frequently to take readings, scanning the air and soil for anomalies. Carter hung back, his gaze darting to every ridge and copse of strange metallic trees as though expecting an ambush. It was mid-morning when we saw the settlement. It was nestled in a shallow valley, a cluster of structures that at first glance could have been a small human village. As we drew closer, the differences became clear. The buildings were crude, made of materials we couldn't immediately identify, something between stone and chitin. Their shapes were angular, almost geometric, but with strange asymmetries that made them look off balance, as though built with an entirely different sense of symmetry. "Are those houses?" Patrick asked. "Looks more like a hive," Carter muttered. We approached cautiously, weapons holstered but ready. The village was silent, eerily so. There were no sounds of life, no voices, no animals, no movement. Patrick moved to examine one of the structures, running his scanner over its surface. This material, organic and mineral, some kind of composite. Whoever made this, they're not primitive. As he spoke, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure just at the edge of the village, ducking behind one of the structures. I froze. "We're not alone," I said. Carter immediately reached for his weapon, scanning the horizon. "Who or what?" Carter asked. "Stay calm," I said, holding up a hand. "We don't know if they're hostile." "Do we know if they're not?" Carter shot back. Another movement, this time two figures slipping between the buildings. They were watching us. I could feel it. We didn't move for a while, waiting for the watchers to make the first move. Eventually, one of them stepped into view. It was humanoid, but just barely. Its legs were stretched out, giving it an awkwardly tall appearance, and its arms hung lower than they should, swaying slightly as it moved. The skin had a pale, almost porcelain-like quality, smooth and uniform, but with irregular patterns that shifted under the light, like ripples frozen in motion. Its face was disturbingly close to human, yet utterly alien in its stillness. The features were flattened, the mouth barely a line, and the eyes, large and reflective like polished glass, seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, locking onto us with an unyielding intensity. "Don't make any sudden moves," I whispered, raising my hand slightly to show we meant no harm. The figure turned its head, as though mimicking my gesture. It made a sound, a melodic tone that spread through the air like a tuning fork. The sound seemed to draw others out from the shadows. Within moments, we were surrounded by at least a dozen of them. "They're communicating," Patrick said, his voice trembling with fear and fascination. "What are they saying?" Carter asked, his hand still hovering over his weapon. "Hell if I know." One of the figures approached, extending a hand, not a gesture of greeting, but something more deliberate. It touched the air in front of us, and the space rippled as though the atmosphere itself was malleable. It made another sound, this one sharper. "They want something," Patrick said, "or they're trying to show us something." "What if they're just distracting us?" Carter hissed. "We don't know what these things are." "They're not attacking," I said. "That's something." The figures remained motionless, watching us with those unnerving, glassy eyes. One of them raised a spindly arm and pointed toward Patrick, who had his scanner raised. "Are they signaling?" Patrick asked, glancing at me with apprehension. "I don't like this," Carter muttered, gripping his sidearm. His fingers twitched against the holster, his tension radiating off him in waves. "Captain, we should back out." The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and exaggerated. It pointed again at the scanner in Patrick's hand and let out a low, vibrating sound. The sound wasn't threatening exactly, but it wasn't comforting either. "I think it's interested in the scanner," Patrick said, lowering the device slightly. "Maybe it's curious. It could be intelligent. Or it's calling its friends," Carter snapped. His eyes darted to the other dwellers, still lingering at the edges of the clearing. One of them moved, taking a step closer. "Hold your fire," I warned, sensing Carter's rising agitation. "Let's not make this worse." Patrick cautiously extended the scanner toward the closest figure, trying to bridge the gap. The figure hesitated, then reached out. Its fingers were long and thin, tapering to points, and they quivered slightly as they hovered over the device. It seemed like the tension might break, but the scanner emitted a sharp beep, an automatic calibration. The figure recoiled violently, emitting a piercing cry that made the air vibrate around us. The other creatures immediately responded, their bodies snapping into motion like taut springs released. "They're freaking out," Carter said, pulling his weapon. He raised it and fired into the air, a warning shot meant to halt their advance. The sound of the shot echoed across the clearing, but it only seemed to agitate them further. The dwellers stopped, their movements becoming unstable, their limbs jerking in sharp motions. One of them let out a growling sound, as though testing its voice. Then they advanced again, faster this time. Carter fired another warning shot and Patrick stumbled back, nearly dropping the scanner in his panic. One of the figures moved quickly, closing the distance faster than I had anticipated. Its long, glassy eyes fixed on me, unblinking. Instinct kicked in, and I raised my weapon, firing, not at it, but at the ground in front of it. The sudden impact made it flinch and skid to a halt, but the others continued to advance. "Back to the ship," I barked, grabbing Patrick by the arm. Carter fired 2 more warning shots as we retreated, the sharp cracks splitting the tense air. The creatures recoiled at the sound but didn't scatter. Instead, they moved faster, their spindly limbs propelling them forward. As we reached the perimeter of the ship, Carter slammed his fist against the control panel to open the hatch. We piled inside, and he quickly sealed the door behind us. The dwellers skidded to a stop just outside, their movements jittery. They didn't try to breach the ship, but stood there, staring at us with those haunting, reflective eyes. "What the hell was that?" Carter asked, his chest heaving. "They were scared," Patrick said. "We startled them. That's why they reacted." "They attacked us," Carter shot back. "That's not fear, that's aggression." "It's not that simple," Patrick insisted. "They were responding to us, like we were a threat." "They're right," Carter muttered under his breath. "We are." We spent the rest of the day locked inside the ship, watching them from a distance. They didn't approach again, but their presence was a constant weight. We set out again the next morning, armed and alert. The figures were gone when we stepped outside, the landscape eerily empty. Carter scanned the horizon, his grip tight on his weapon. "If they're gone, it's not because they gave up," he muttered. Patrick seemed less concerned, his focus entirely on his scanner. "The readings are stronger inland," he said. "There's something big out there, some kind of structure maybe." The terrain became stranger as we traveled. The grass gave way to crystalline outcroppings that sparkled in the sunlight, their surfaces unnaturally smooth. The air became warmer, the metallic taste intensifying. Even the sky seemed different, the clouds moving in bizarre patterns, as though responding to some unseen force. "This place isn't stable," Carter said. "The ground, the air, even the light, everything's off. It's like the planet's awake." "Not awake," Patrick corrected. "Engineered. This isn't natural. Someone built this, shaped it." The idea unsettled me more than I cared to admit. If the planet was a creation, who or what had created it? And for what purpose? We continued in silence, the tension growing with every step. It wasn't long before the anomalies became more pronounced. The air seemed to thrum with energy, and my skin prickled as though we were being watched. "I don't like this," Carter muttered, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Feels like a trap." "It's not a trap," Patrick said. "It's a system. Something's guiding us." It was midday when we found the first sign of something truly alien. A structure half buried in the ground, its surface smooth and black, like obsidian. Patrick approached it cautiously, his scanner held out in front of him. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with awe. "This is what's been sending out the readings." "What is it?" Carter asked, keeping his distance. "Some kind of device," Patrick replied. "It's not human, that's for sure. The material, it's not registering. It's like it doesn't exist." As he spoke, the device emitted a soft noise and the ground around it began to shift. Patterns appeared in the soil, intricate and geometric, forming a circle around the structure. "Back up!" I ordered, my instincts screaming that we were in danger. But Patrick didn't listen. He reached out to touch the device, his fingers brushing its surface. The noise became louder, and the air around us seemed to warp, bending light and sound. The device emitted a brief burst, then went silent. The patterns in the ground faded, leaving nothing but disturbed soil. "What the hell was that?" Carter demanded. "An interface," Patrick said, his voice trembling with excitement. "It reacted to me. It's trying to communicate." The encounter with the device marked a turning point. The anomalies became more intense as we moved deeper, the environment shifting around us in patterns we couldn't predict or explain. Trees twisted and reshaped themselves as we passed, their branches curling like grasping fingers. The ground beneath our feet seemed to ripple, the patterns from the device reappearing briefly before fading. We found the second structure just before nightfall, standing tall and imposing against the darkening sky. Its surface was covered in the same patterns as the device. The structure responded to our presence. The air around us shimmered, and I felt weightless, as though the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. Shapes began to emerge from the shimmering air, towering figures, each easily 10 feet tall. Their forms were humanoid in outline, with smooth, featureless faces. Their bodies had an unsettling translucence, like frosted glass, revealing shifting patterns within, as though light and energy flowed through them. Their featureless faces reflected the glowing structure, amplifying its light, and I felt as though the figures were appraising us, testing us without uttering a single word. The weight of their presence pressed against my senses, not with malice, but with an alien indifference so profound it felt like the universe itself had turned its gaze on us. It wasn't fear I felt. It was insignificance. "Look at them," Patrick said, his voice shaking. "They're not like the creatures in the village. They're something older. Whoever built this place, these structures, it has to be them. They've shaped this entire planet down to every detail." "Shaped it?" Carter snapped. "You're jumping to conclusions. We don't even know what we're looking at." I grabbed Patrick's arm, pulling him back. "We don't know what they are," I said, trying to stay calm. "And we don't know what they want. Speculating doesn't change that." The towering figures surrounded us. There were 6 of them now, forming a loose circle around us. I couldn't tell if they were looking at us. Without eyes, there was no way to be sure. But I felt their focus, a weight that pressed against my mind. Patrick was the first to speak. "They're not just watching us. They're judging." "Judging what?" Carter spat. "What the hell do they want?" "They want us to listen," I said, the words slipping out before I could think. I didn't know how I knew, it was just a feeling, like a whisper at the back of my mind. The voice wasn't a sound. It bypassed my ears entirely, slipping straight into my thoughts like a memory I'd forgotten until that moment. It wasn't a single voice, but a chorus, layered, immense, and utterly alien. "You have disrupted the balance." The words weren't accusatory, but they carried an undeniable weight. I glanced at Patrick and Carter and saw the same expressions on their faces: shock, fear, and a dawning understanding that we were completely out of our depth. "What balance?" I managed to say, though I wasn't sure if the words came out aloud or in my thoughts. "The equilibrium of this iteration. Your presence introduces contamination. This cannot persist." "What do you mean, iteration?" Patrick asked. "What is this place? Who are you?" The figures didn't move, but their presence seemed to intensify like a rising tide. The voice returned, cold and detached. "This is one of many. A reflection, an experiment. Your kind calls it Earth. This is its shadow. We refine what was flawed." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "You're recreating Earth? Recreating us?" "No." The voice was firm, as if the concept offended them. "Not recreating, improving. We take what exists and impose structure, balance, potential, many versions. Some succeed, others fail." "You've done this before. How many times?" There was a long pause, as though the question required calculation. When the voice returned, it carried a faint undercurrent of something that might have been impatience. "Countless." I struggled to process their words. This wasn't just one experiment, this was one in an endless sequence. "You're playing God," Carter said, his voice filled with anger and fear. "Creating worlds, playing with lives. Who gave you the right?" "Rights are irrelevant. We seek refinement. You seek understanding. Both are instinctual. Neither requires permission." "They don't care," I said quietly, the realization sinking in. "They don't care about us, about anyone. It's all just data to them." "What happens now?" I asked, forcing the words through the lump in my throat. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, though I wasn't sure if it was anger or fear that gripped me. "The contamination must be removed." Carter's hand shot to his sidearm. "You're going to kill us!" The figures didn't react, but the voice returned, cold and impassive. "Destruction is waste. Removal is precision." "What does that mean?" Patrick asked, his voice tight with fear. The air around us shimmered again, and for a moment I thought the ground had fallen away entirely. My vision distorted, and I felt an unusual tug in my chest, like something inside me was falling apart. The voice spoke again, and this time it wasn't addressing us. It was addressing itself. "Memories disrupt the continuum. They are incompatible with the system. Removal restores equilibrium. Images flashed before my eyes, the crystalline grass, the metallic trees, the dwellers, the towering figures. They came faster and faster until they became a chaotic rush of sensations I couldn't hold on to. When I opened my eyes, I was back on the Stellar Seeker. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my mind, but something felt off, like I'd woken from a dream I couldn't quite remember. The others were there too, sitting in their seats, staring blankly at the control panels. Patrick rubbed his temples, his appearance drained of color. Carter's face showed signs of confusion. "What just happened?" Carter asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," I said, the words tasting strange in my mouth. I tried to think back, to piece together how we'd gotten here, but my memories were scattered like a puzzle missing half its pieces. I can't remember the last few days," Patrick said. What were we doing?" None of us had an answer. The ship's logs showed that we were traveling through our usual route, moving steadily from one system to the next. Nothing seemed out of place, yet an inexplicable emptiness hung in the air. We resumed our journey, the ship gliding through the endless void. The routine of exploration seemed pointless, as if we were just going through the motions with no real purpose. The stars outside the viewport were the same as they'd always been, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something important. At night I dreamed of shapes and shimmering light. I saw figures, tall and faceless, standing in the distance watching me. When I woke, the images faded quickly, leaving only an ache in my chest, like a piece of myself had been taken, and I didn't know how to get it back. Carter became quieter, his usual sharpness dulled by a tension he couldn't explain. Patrick became consumed with abstract ideas, obsessively sketching strange geometric patterns and theorizing about concepts he couldn't articulate. His notes were scattered and unfocused, filled with equations that led nowhere and shapes that seemed almost familiar, though he couldn't say why. He muttered to himself often, his frustration mounting as he tried to make sense of something just out of reach. As for me, I stared at the stars and felt small, smaller than I'd ever felt before. One evening, as I sat alone in the observation deck, staring out at the infinite expanse of space, I felt a pang of longing so intense it brought tears to my eyes. For what? I didn't know. The stars seemed farther away than ever, their light cold and indifferent. I placed my hand on the glass, my reflections staring back at me. For a moment it looked unfamiliar, as though I were looking at a stranger. I turned away, the ache in my chest growing heavier. The ship glided onward, its course set for the next system. Somewhere, out there, answers waited. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I wanted to find them.